Hi, I'm going to be reading from chapter 6 of Alas Babylon today. Always before, important events and dates had been marked in memory with definite labels. Not only such days as Thanksgiving, New Year's, Lincoln's birthday, but Pearl Harbor Day, D-Day, VE Day, VJ Day, Income Tax Day. This December Saturday, ever after, was simply known as the day. That was sufficient. Everyone remembered exactly what they did and saw and said on the day. People unconsciously were inclined to split time into two new periods, before the day and after the day. Thus, a man might say, well, before the day, I was an automobile dealer. Now I operate a trot line for catfish. Or a mother might boast, oh, yes, Oscar passed his college boards. Of course, that was before the day. Or a younger mother might say, Hope was born after the day. I wonder about her teeth. This semantic device was not entirely original. Several generations of Southerners had referred to before and after the war without being required to explain what war. It seemed incongruous to call the day a war, Russo-American, East-West, or World War III, because the war really was all over in a single day. Furthermore, nobody in the Western Hemisphere ever saw the fact of a human enemy. Very few actually saw an enemy aircraft or submarine, and missiles appeared only on the most sensitive radar screens. Most of those who died in North America saw nothing at all, since they died in bed in a millisecond, slipping from sleep into deeper darkness. So the struggle was not again a human enemy or for victory. The struggle for those who survived the day was to survive the next. The truth was not entirely or easily assimilated by Randy. Although he was better prepared for it than most, it was totally outside his experience and without precedent in history. On the day itself, whatever else he might be doing, he was never beyond sound of a radio, awaiting the news that ought to accompany war, news of victories or defeats, mobilizations, proclamations, declarations, a message from the president, words of leadership, steadfastness, and unity. Altogether, there were 7 radios in the house, and all of them were kept turned on except the clock radio in Peyton's room, where the child, her eyes lubricated and bandaged, slept with the help of Dan Gunn's sedatives. Even when he ran up or down stairs or discovered imperative duties outside, Randy carried his tiny transistor portable. Twice he left the grounds, once on a buying mission to town, and again briefly to visit the McGoverns. The picture window on the riverside of the McGovern home had been cracked by the concussion, and this, rather than the more terrifying and deadly implications of the day, had had such a traumatic effect on Lavinia. She had been fed sleeping pills, and put to bed. Lib and her father were functioning well, even bravely, and Randy was relieved. He could not escape his primary duty, which was to his own family, his brother's wife and children. He could not devote his mind and energy to the protection of 2 homes at once. Until mid-afternoon, Randy heard only the quavery and uninformative 30-second broadcast from WSMF. Now he was downstairs in the dining room with Helen, and she had been making an inventory of necessities in the house, discovering a surprising number of items she considered essential, war or no war, which Randy had entirely forgotten. He was eating steak and vegetables. Helen, disapproving of his cannibal sandwiches, had insisted on cooking for him and washing it down with orange juice. Leaning back in the scarred, massive captain's chair, he relaxed for the first time since dawn. A weariness flowed upward from his throbbing legs. He had slept only 2 or 3 hours in the past 36, and he knew that when he finished eating, the fatigue would seep through his whole body, and it would be necessary to sleep again. Across the circular waxed teak table, looking fresh and competent, Helen sipped a scotch and checked what she called her must list. One of us, she was saying, has got to make another trip to town. I have to have detergent for the dishwasher and washing machine, soap, powder, paper napkins, toilet paper. We ought to have more candles, and I wish I could get my hands on some more of those old-fashioned kerosene lamps. And Randy, what about ammunition? I don't like to sound scary, but the radio, in an interval of silence between the local Conrad broadcasts, suddenly squealed with an alien and powerful carrier wave. Then they heard a new voice. This is your National Civil Defense Headquarters. The front legs of Randy's chair hit the floor. He was wide awake. The voice was familiar. The voice of a network newscaster, not one of the best-known New York or Washington correspondents, but still recognizable, a strong and welcome voice connecting them with the world beyond the borders of Timucuan County. It continued, all local Conrad stations will please leave the air now and whenever they hear this signal. This is an emergency clear channel network. If the signal strength is erratic, do not change stations. It is because the signal is rotated between a number of transmitters in order to prevent bombing by enemy aircraft. The next voice you will hear will be that of Acting Chief Executive of the United States, Mrs. Josephine Van Brooker Brown. Randy couldn't believe it. Mrs. Van Brooker Brown was the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare in the President's cabinet, or had been until the day. So the implications we should be picking up on are in terms of survival. She is the highest ranking person who has survived on the president's cabinet. And if something were to happen to both the president, vice president, speaker of the House, they then start with the cabinet members in the president's cabinet. And then they keep going until, they find somebody who has survived. And in this case, it was Mrs. Josephine Van Brooker Brown. Then they heard her Radcliffe, Boston voice. It was Miss Van Brooker Brown, all right. She said, fellow countrymen, as all of you know by now, at dawn this morning, this country and our allies in the free world were attacked without warning with thermonuclear and atomic weapons. Most of our great cities have been destroyed. Others have been contaminated and their evacuations ordered. The toll of innocent lives taken on this new and darker day of infamy cannot as yet be estimated. These first sentences had been clearly and bravely spoken, but now her voice faltered, as if she found it difficult to say what it was now necessary to say. The very fact that I speak to you as the chief executive of the nation must tell you much. They heard her sob. No president, Helen whispered. No Washington, Randy said. I guess she was out of Washington, at home, or speaking somewhere whenever the lives... Randy hushed. Mrs. Van Brooker Brown was talking again. Our reprisal was swift, and from the reports that have reached this command post, effective. The enemy has received terrible punishment. Several hundred of its missile and air bases from Chukchi Peninsula in the Baltic and from Vladivostok to the Black Sea have certainly been destroyed. The Navy has sunk or damaged at least 100 submarines in North American waters. The United States has been badly hurt, but it is by no means defeated. The battle goes on. Our reprisals continue. However, further enemy attacks must be expected. There is reason to believe that the enemy air forces have not yet been fully committed. We must be prepared to withstand heavy blows. As Chief Executive of the United States and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, I hereby declare a state of unlimited national emergency until such time as new elections are held and Congress reconvenes. In the devastated areas and in those other areas where normal functions of government cannot be carried out, I hereby declare martial law to be administered by the Army. I appointed Lieutenant General George Honaker, Army Chief of Staff and Director of Martial Law in the Zone of the Interior, which means within the 49 states. There have been grave dislocations of communication, of industrial, economic, and financial functions. I declare effective at this moment a moratorium on the payment of all debts, rents, taxes, interest, mortgages, insurance claims, and premiums, and all and any other financial obligations from the duration of the emergency. So when a moratorium is declared, it's like a stop. So Mrs. Van Brucker Brown has essentially said, because the United States has been damaged so badly financially with its infrastructure, meaning roads, airports, electricity, all of that sort of stuff, that, there is a new primary focus, and it is not going to be on collecting rent, collecting mortgage payments, paying credit card bills, that sort of stuff. And again, I've pointed out many times, at least during this pandemic, that we can find parallels in this book. Obviously, we're not suffering from an atomic war, but moratoriums were called on mortgages and rents in many cities across the United States. So you can definitely understand what's going on. From time to time, God willing, I will use these facilities to bring you further information as it is received and to issue further decrees as they become necessary. I call upon you to obey the orders of your local civil defense directors, state and municipal authorities, and of the military. Do not panic. Some of you must have guessed how it happens that I, the head of the most junior of government departments and a woman, have been forced to assume the duties and responsibilities of chief executive on this most terrible day in our history. One of the first targets of the enemy was Washington. So far as we have been able to discover at this hour, neither the president, nor the vice president, nor any cabinet member, nor the leaders of the House or Senate survived. It appears certain that only a small percentage of the members of Congress escaped. I survived only by chance because this morning I was in another city on an inspection tour. I am now in a military command post of relative safety, and I have designated this command post Civil Defense Headquarters as well as temporary seat of government, meaning the new capital. Mrs. Van Brucker Brown coughed and choked, recovered herself, and continued. With a sick heart, but the resolution to lead the nation to victory and peace, I leave you for the time being. The radio hummed for a second, the carrier wave cut off, and then there was silence. Randy said, "It's about what I expected, but it's awful to hear it." Still, Helen said, "There's the government. I guess that's some sort of comfort. I wonder what's left. I wonder what cities are left." Helen looked up at Randy. She looked at him and through him and far away. Her hands came together on the table and her fingers intertwined, and when she spoke, it was in a soft, almost inaudible voice, as if her thoughts were so fragile that they would be shattered by more than a whisper. Do you think? Is it possible that the military command post she spoke of could be Offutt Field? Do you think that she might be down in what we call the hole at SAC headquarters? Because if she is at SAC, you know what that means, don't you? It could mean that Mark is okay, but Helen, yes? Randy didn't think it was likely that Mrs. Van Brooker Brown was speaking from Omaha. The odds were against it. There were many headquarters, and the first one the enemy would try to destroy after Washington itself was SAC. Mark had feared this, and so did he. He said, I think we shouldn't count on it. I'm not counting on it, I'm just praying. If Mark is alive, how long do you think it'll be before we hear from him? I can't even guess. But I do know who can make an educated guess, and that's Admiral Hazard. He lives on the other side of the Henry's place, and he listens to shortwave and keeps up with everything that goes on. He served a tour in ONI and later was on the intelligence staff of the Joint Chiefs. I think that was his last duty before they retired him. So, if anybody around here should know anything about what's going on, then old Sam Hazard should know. Can we see him? Of course we can see him, anytime you want. It's only a quarter of a mile, but we can't leave Peyton alone, and I don't have any idea what time Dan Gunn will get here. His arms felt wooden and detached, and his head felt too heavy for his neck. His chin dropped on his chest. And I'm so blessed tired, Helen. I feel that if I don't get a couple of hours of real sleep, I'll go off my rocker. And if I don't get some rest, I won't be much good from here on in, and God knows what'll happen tonight. Helen said, I'm really sorry, Randy. Of course, you're groggy. Go upstairs and get some sleep. I'm going to drive to town. There's so much stuff we've just got to have. Suppose Peyton calls, I'll never wake up. Ben Franklin will be here, and I'll tell him to wake you up if anything serious happens. Okay, but be careful. Don't stop for anybody on the way to town. Randy went upstairs, each step an effort. It was true, he thought, that women have more stamina than men. Randy decided not actually to take off his clothes and get into bed, because once he got under the covers, he would never get up. Instead, he took off his shoes and dropped down on the couch in the living room, and he looked at the gun rack on the opposite wall. Until very recent years, guns had become an important part of living on the Timucuan. Randy guessed that they might become important again. He had quite an arsenal. There was the long old-fashioned .34 Krag fitted with sporting sights, the carbine he had carried in Korea, dismantled and smuggled home, two .22 rifles, one equipped with a scope, a 12-gauge automatic, and a light, beautifully balanced 20-gauge double-barreled shotgun. In the drawer of the bedside table was a .45 automatic and a .22 pistol hung in its holster in his closet. Ammo. He had more than he would ever need for the big rifle, the carbine, and the shotguns, but he only had a couple of boxes of .22s, and he guessed that the .22s might be the most useful weapon he owned. If economic chaos lasted for a long time, a meat shortage developed, and it became necessary to hunt small game. He rose and went into the hallway and shouted at the stairwell, Helen! Yes? She was at the front door. If you get a chance, drop in at Beck's Hardware and buy some .22 caliber long rifle hollow points. Just a second, I'll write it down on my list. .22 long rifle hollow points. How many? 10 boxes if they have them. Helen said, I'll try. Now, Randy, get some sleep. So usually, prior to chapter 6, I have my students make a list of 10 items that they would need for survival. And then I kind of have them look at the list as we read the book. Because I like them to see if they planned well enough. So something that you could definitely do now is create your own like little survival list of things that you would bring if you needed to survive for a long time. And I always tell them you can't write down unlimited amounts of food or unlimited amounts of soda, so on and so forth. So if you want to, just to see how you would fare in your survival techniques, make a list of 10 things that you would need for your survival. Back on the couch, he closed his eyes, thinking of guns and hunting. In his father's youth, this section of Florida had been a hunter's paradise with quail, dove, duck, and deer in plenty, and even black bear and a rare panther. Now the quail were scattered and often scarce. 3 coveys roamed the grove, and the hammock behind the Henry's place. Randy had not shot quail for 12 years. When visitors noticed his gun rack and asked about quail shooting, he always laughed and said, those guns are to shoot people who try to shoot my quail. The quail were more than pets. They were friends and wonderful to watch, parading across the lawn and road in the early morning. By the way, in case you were wondering what a covey is basically what they call like a group of quail. Only the ducks were now truly plentiful in this area, and they were protected by federal law. Once in a while, he shot a rattlesnake in the grove or a moccasin near the dock, and that was all he shot. Still, there were rabbits and squirrels, and so the .22 ammo might come in handy. A long time ago, he could not have been more than 14 or 15, he remembered hunting deer with his father, shooting his first deer with buckshot from the double 20, his first and his last, for the deer had not died instantly, and it seemed small and piteous, twitching in the palmetto scrub until his father had dispatched it with his pistol. He could still see it in the round bright red spots on the green fronds, and he shivered and he slept. Randy awoke in darkness. Graff was barking, and he heard voices downstairs. He turned on a light. It was 9:30. He had slept almost 4 hours. He felt refreshed and good for whatever might come upon them through the night. He was putting on his shoes when the door opened and Helen came into his apartment, followed by Ben Franklin and Dan Gunn. I was just going to wake you up, Helen said. Dan is going to go in and look at Peyton now. Dan's eyes were hollowed and his face carved with fissures of exhaustion. Randy said, have you eaten today, Dan? I don't know. I don't think so. Helen said, you'll eat, Doctor, right after you've seen Peyton. Do you want me to go in with you? You and Randy can both come in with me, but don't say anything. Let me do the talking. They went into the child's room, and Randy flicked on the overhead light. Not that one, Dan said. I want to dim light it first. And he turned on a lamp on the dressing table. Peyton's hands crept out from under the sheet and touched the bandages over her eyes. Hello? She said, her voice small and frightened. Hello, dear, Helen said. Dr. Gunn is here to see you. You remember Dr. Gunn from last year, don't you? Oh, yes. Hello, Doctor. Dan said, Peyton, I'm going to take the bandages off your eyes. Don't be surprised if you don't see anything. There isn't much light in the room. Randy found that he was holding his breath. Dan removed the bandages, saying, Now don't rub your eyes. Peyton tried to open her eyes. She's like, They're stuck. They're, they feel all gooey. Sure, Dan said. He moistened cotton in a borax mixture and wiped Peyton's eyes gently. That better? Peyton blinked. Hey, I can see. Well, sort of. Everything looks milky. Helen moved and Peyton said, Isn't that you, Mother? Yes, that's me. Your face looks like a balloon, but I could tell it was you. Dan smiled at Randy and nodded. She was going to be all right. He rummaged in his bag and brought out a small kit, a bottle and an applicator and a tube, and he said, Peyton, you can stop worrying now. You're not going to be blind. In perhaps a week, you'll be able to see fine, but until then, you've got to rest your eyes, and we have to treat them. This is going to sting a little. He held open her eyelids, and his large hands, sure and gentle, applied drops and an ointment. Butyl sulfate, he said. This is really outside my line, but I remembered that butyl sulfate was what Air Sea Rescue used for rescued flyers after floating around in a raft for 2 or 3 days. The glare would blind them, just as Peyton was blinded. It fixed them up, and it ought to fix her up. Dan turned to Helen. Did you see how I did it? I was watching. I won't have any trouble. Peyton's quite brave. Peyton said, Mommy, I'm not. I'm not brave at all. I'm scared all the time. Have you heard from Dad yet? Do you think Dad's all right? I'm sure he's all right, dear, Helen said, but we can't expect to hear right away. All the phones are out, and I suppose the telegraph, too. I'm hungry, Mother. Helen said, I'll bring something right up. They turned off the light. Helen went downstairs, and Dan Gunn came into Randy's rooms. He took off his wrinkled jacket and dropped it on a chair and said, Now I can use a drink. Randy mixed a double bourbon, and Dan drank half of it in a gulp and said, surprised, Aren't you drinking, Randy? No, don't feel like I want one. That's the first good news I've heard all day. I've already treated 2 fellows who've drunk themselves insensible since morning. You could have been the 3rd. Could I? Well, not quite. You react to crisis in the right way. Guys, this part right here is really important. You remember what Toynbee says? His theory of challenge and response applies not only to nations, but to individuals. Some nations and some people melt in the heat of crisis and come apart like fat in the pan. Others meet the challenge and harden. And I think that you are going to harden. So essentially what he's saying is people who are unwilling to adapt and change and realize that things are different and that in order to survive, they're going to have to do things differently. Those people who are unwilling to do that will not survive. But Randy is going to survive. He's going to harden. He's going to, he's not going to be the fat in the pan that melts away. Okay? I'm really not a very hard guy, Randy said, looking across the room at his guns and thinking oddly of the young buck he'd shot when he was a boy, and how he'd never been able to shoot a deer since that day. To change the subject, he said, You must have had a pretty harrowing day. Dan drank the second half of his bourbon and water. I've had such a day as I didn't think it was possible to have. 7 cardiacs are dead, and a couple more will go before morning. 3 miscarriages, and one of the women died. I don't know what killed her. I'd put down fright on the death certificate if I had time to make death certificates. And we've had 3 suicides. One of them was Edgar Quisenberry. Randy said, Edgar? Why? Dan frowned. Hard to say. He still had as much as anybody else or more, and he wasn't organically ill. I'll refer to Toynbee again. The inability to cope with a sudden change in the environment. He swam in a sea of money, And when money was transmuted back into paper, he was left gasping and confused, and he died. You've read the history of the 29 crash, haven't you? Yes. Dozens of people killed themselves for the same reason. They created and lived in an environment of paper profits. And when paper returned to being just paper, they had to kill themselves, not realizing that their environment was unnatural and artificial. But it wasn't the adults that got me down, Randy. It was the babies. Give me another drink, a small one. Randy poured another. 8 babies today, 3 of them preemies. I've got the preemies in San Marco Hospital, and I don't know whether they'll make it or not. The hospital's a mess. Cots end to end on every corridor. A good many of them are accident cases, a few gunshot wounds, and all this, mind you, with only 3 casualties caused directly by the war. 3 cases of radiation poisoning. Radiation, Randy said. Around here? Suddenly, that word had a new and more immediate connotation. It was now a sinister word of lingering death, like cancer. No, refugees from Tallahassee. They drove through pretty heavy fallout, I guess, and we estimate at the hospital that they received 50 to 100 rotogens. Anyway, a pretty hefty dose, but not fatal. Are we getting any radiation, do you think? Dan considered. Some, undoubtedly, but I don't think a dangerous dose. There isn't a Geiger counter in town, but there is a dosimeter in the San Marco Hospital, and I guess that we're getting about what San Marco gets. And most of the radioactive particles decay pretty fast, you know, but not cesium or strontium 90 or cobalt or carbon 14. Those will always be with us. Lucky east wind, Randy said, and then was surprised at his words. The danger of radiation was still there and might increase. Long before this day, scientists had been worried about tests of nuclear weapons, even when conducted in uninhabited areas under rigid controls. Now the danger, obviously, was infinitely greater. But since there were other and more immediate dangers that you could see, feel, and hear, radiation had become secondary. He was thinking of its effect upon future generations, and he was concerned with the present. He wasn't exercised over the fallout blanketing Tallahassee from the attack on Jacksonville. He was worried about Fort Repose. He suspected that this was a necessary mental adjustment to aid self-preservation. The exhausted swimmer struggling to reach shore isn't worried about starving to death afterwards. When Helen called, they sat down to a dinner table that under the circumstances seemed incongruous. The meal was only soup, salad, and sandwiches, but Helen had laid the table as meticulously as if Dan Gunn had agreed to stay for a late supper on an ordinary evening. When Ben Franklin sat down, Helen said, "Did you wash your hands?" "No, ma'am." "Well, do so." And Ben disappeared and returned with his hands washed and his hair combed. And they listened to the radio as they ate, hearing only the local broadcasts from San Marco at 2-minute intervals. Their ears had become dulled to the repetitive, unimportant announcements and warnings, as those who live on the seashore fail to hear the sea. But any fresh news or a break in the routine instantly alerted and silenced them. So, one of the reasons why Helen asked Ben Franklin if he went to go wash his hands, I mean, you may be thinking in terms of coronavirus and pandemic, and of course, now we're hand washing at an alarming rate. It seems like everything you touch, it's like hand sanitizer or hand washing. But even though there's total chaos going on outside, what did Helen do? She set the table for dinner. She's establishing or trying to preserve a routine. And before you sit down to eat, you go wash your hands. And so Helen wasn't letting Ben Franklin get away with anything just because there's chaos and a nuclear war going on. She's like, you young man are going to go wash your hands because that's what we do. Okay. And it was Ben Franklin washed his hands, and it was Helen's effort to preserve routine and order in otherwise chaos. Several times they heard a brief bulletin. County civil defense authorities warn everyone not to drink fresh milk, which may have been exposed to fallout. Canned milk or milk delivered this morning prior to the attack can be presumed safe. Dan Gunn explained that this precaution was probably a little premature. It was designed primarily for the protection of children. Strontium-90, probably the most dangerous of all fallout materials, collected in calcium. It caused bone cancer and leukemia. In a week or so, it could be a real hazard, he said. It can't be a hazard yet because the cows haven't had time to ingest strontium-90 in their fodder. Still, the quicker these dangers are broadcast, the more people will be aware of them. Helen said, what happens to the babies? Evaporated or condensed canned milk is the answer while it lasts, and after that, it's mother's milk. That will be old-fashioned, won't it? Dan nodded and smiled. But the mothers will have to be careful about what they eat. He looked down at the lettuce. For instance, no greens or lettuce if your garden has received fallout. Trouble is, you won't really know whether your ground or your food is safe or not. Not without a Geiger counter. Well, we'll all have to live as the best we can from day to day. Ben Franklin looked up at the ceiling, listening. He said, listen. The others heard it, very faintly. A jet, Ben said. A fighter, I think. The sound faded away. Randy discovered that he had been holding his breath. He said, I guess it's still going on. Helen laid her salad fork on the plate. She had eaten very little. She said, I have to know what's happening. I just have to. Can we please go see your retired admiral tonight, Randy? Sure, we can see him. But what about Peyton? We can't leave her alone. Helen looked at Ben Franklin, and Ben said, is this what I'm going to be, a professional babysitter? Dan Gunn rose. I've got to get back to town now. I've got to check in at the clinic, and then I've got to get some sleep. Why don't you stay here for the night, Dan? Randy said. I can't. They're expecting me at the clinic. And Randy, I brought the emergency kit for you. He turned to Helen. It was a wonderful supper. Thanks. I was so hungry, I was weak, and I didn't even realize it. Randy walked him to his car. Dan said, that poor girl. Peyton? No. Helen. Uncertainty is the worst. She'd be better off knowing if she'd be better off if she knew Mark was dead. See you tomorrow, Randy. Yes, tomorrow. He walked back to the house and paused on the porch to look at the thermometer and barometer. The barometer was steady, very high. Temperature was down to 55. It would get colder tonight. It might go to 40 before morning. From across the river, far off, he heard a string of shouts in the stillness at night, and across water the sound of shots carried for miles. He could not tell from whence the sound came or guess why, but the shots reminded him of a nervous sentry on post, cutting loose with his carbine. It sounded like a carbine or an automatic pistol. He walked into the house, head down, and went up to his bedroom and pulled on a sweater. He called Ben Franklin to the living room, and Ben came in, his mother following. Ben? Randy? Sorry. Ben, Randy said, ever shoot a pistol? Only once, on the range at Offutt. What about a rifle? I've shot a .22, and I'm pretty good with a .22. Okay, Randy said. I'm going to give you what you're good at. He walked to the gun rack. The Mossberg was fitted with a 6-power scope, and a scope was not good for snap shooting and hard to use at night. He took down the Remington pump, a weapon with open sights, a present from his father on his 13th birthday, and he handed it to Ben. The boy took it, pleased, and worked the action and peered into the chamber. "It's not loaded now," Randy said, "but from now on every gun in this house is going to be loaded, and I hope we never have to use them, but if we do, there probably won't be any time to load up." Helen said, "I forgot to tell you, Randy. I couldn't get 10 boxes of the ammunition you wanted, but I did get 3. They're somewhere in the kitchen, and I'll find them later." "Thanks," Randy said, and he took a package of the cartridges out of the ammunition case and handed it to Ben. "You load up your gun, Ben," he said. "It's yours now. Never point it at a man unless you intend to shoot him, and never shoot unless you mean to kill. Do you understand that?" Ben's eyes were round and his face sober. "Yes, sir." "Okay, Ben. You can babysit now. We should be back in about an hour." When Rear Admiral Hazard retired, he embarked upon what he liked to call "my second life." He and his wife had prepared carefully for retirement. They had wanted an orange grove to supplement his pensions and a body of water upon which he could look and in which he could fish. While still a four-striper, he had located the spot on the Timaquan and bought it for a surprisingly reasonable sum. The real estate agent had carefully explained that the low price included, and I will not use this word, black people for neighbors, meaning the Henrys. At the same time, the agent had grumbled at the Braggs, who had allowed the Henrys to buy waterfront property in the first place, thereby lowering values all along the entire river, or so he had said. The Hazards first had planted a grove. A few years later, they built a comfortable 6-room rambler and started landscaping the grounds. Thereafter, they lived in the house 1 month each year when Sam took his annual leave, and trying it and wearing it in until it fitted perfectly. On his 62nd birthday, Sam Hazard retired, to the relief of a number of his fellow admirals. There were rivalries within as well as between the armed services. In the Navy, the rivalry had been between the battleship and carrier admirals. When it became a rivalry between atomic subs and supercarriers, Hazard had outspokenly favored the submarines, since he once had commanded a carrier task force and had never been a submariner. The carrier admirals regarded his stand as just short of treason. Worse, for years he had claimed that if Russia's most dangerous threat was the terrible combination of submarines equipped with missiles armed with nuclear warheads, such a theory, if unchallenged, would force the Navy to spend a greater part of its energy and money on anti-submarine warfare. Since this per se was defense, and since the Navy's whole tradition was to take the offensive, Hazard spent the final years of duty conning a desk. 2 days after his retirement, his wife died. So she never really lived in the house on the Timaquan, and she never physically shared his second life. Yet often she seemed close. When he trimmed a shrub she had planted, or when in the evenings he sat alone on the patio and reached to touch the arm of the chair at his side. The Admiral discovered there were not enough hours in the day to do all the things that were necessary and that he had wanted to do. There was the citrus, the grounds, experiments with exotic varieties of bananas and papaya, discrete essays to be written for the United States Naval Institute proceedings, and not so discreet articles for magazines of general circulation, Sam Hazard found that the Henrys were extraordinarily convenient neighbors. Malachi tended the grounds and helped design and build the dock, and Two-Tone, when in the mood, broke and sober, worked in the grove. The Henry women cleaned and did his laundry. Preacher Henry was the admiral's private fishing guide, which meant that the admiral consistently caught more and bigger bass than anyone on the Timaquan and possibly in all of Central Florida. But Sam Hazard's principal hobby was listening to shortwave radio. He was not a ham operator. He had no transmitter. He just listened. He did not chatter. He monitored the military frequencies in the foreign broadcasts. With his enormous background of military and political knowledge, he kept pace with the world outside Fort Repose. Sometimes, perhaps, he was a bit ahead of everyone else. It was 10 to 11 when Randy knocked on Admiral Hazard's door, and it opened immediately. The Admiral was a taut, neatly made man who weighed 133 when he boxed for the Academy and who weighed 133 now. He was dressed in a white turtleneck sweater, flannels, and boat shoes. A halo of cottony hair encircled his sunburned bald spot. Otherwise, he was not saintly. His nose had been flattened in some long-forgotten brawl in Port Said or Marseille. His gray eyes, canopied by heavy white brows, were red-rimmed and angry. For the Admiral, this had been a day of frustration, helplessness, and hatred. Hatred for the unimaginative, pure-blind, selfish fools who had not believed him, and frustration because on this day of supreme danger and need, his lifetime of training and experience was not and could not be put to use. The Admiral said, "I saw your headlights coming down the road. Come on in." He squinted at Helen. "My sister-in-law, Helen Bragg," Randy said. "An evil day to receive a beautiful woman," the Admiral said, his voice surprisingly mild and mannered to issue from such a pugnacious face. "Come on in to my command plot and listen to the war, if such a massacre can be called the war." He led them down to his den. A heavily planked workbench ran along the wall under the windows overlooking the river. On this bench was a large black professional-looking shortwave receiver, a steaming coffee maker, notebooks and pencils. The radio screeched with power, static, interference, and occasional words in the almost intelligible language of conflict. On two other walls, cork-covered, were pinned maps, the polar projection and the Eurasian landmass on one wall, a military map of the United States on the other. A hoarse voice broke through the static. "This is Adelaide 651. I am sitting on a skunk at Alpha Romeo Papa 4. Skunk at Alpha Romeo Papa 4. A different voice replied immediately. "Adelaide 651. This is Adelaide. Hold 1. There was a silence for a moment, and then the second voice continued. "Adelaide 651. Adelaide. Have relayed your message to Hector. He is busy, but will be free in 10 to 15 minutes. Squat on that skunk and wait for Hector." "Adelaide, from Adelaide 651. Charlie." Helen sat down for the first time that day, and she was showing fatigue. The Admiral said, "Coffee?" "I'd love a cup," she said. Randy said, "Sam, what was that on the radio? Part of the war?" Also, and as I have explained before, part of the author's choice when he wrote this book, okay, was to use military terms and terminology, and obviously we don't know, we the readers, okay, don't necessarily know what all of this means, but it was done that way on purpose, right? Because the average civilian would have no idea, right? And I guess that's what the author is trying to communicate. And so they need Randy and Helen need Admiral Hazard, who is going to be there and be able to translate. Okay. The Admiral poured coffee before he replied. A big part of it for us. Right now, I'm tuned to a Navy and Air Force ASW frequency in the 5 megaband cycle. ASW? Anti-submarine warfare. I'll interpret. A Navy Super Connie with a saucer random has located a skunk, an enemy submarine, at coordinates Alpha Romeo Papa 4. I happen to know that that's about 300 miles off of Norfolk, as in Norfolk, Virginia. The radar picket has called home to base, Adelaide, and Adelaide is sending Hector to knock off the skunk. Hector is one of our killer subs, but Hector is presently engaged. When he is free, he will communicate directly with Adelaide 651, and the plane will give Hector a course, and when he is in range, Hector will cut loose with a bombing torpedo, and that will be the end of the skunk, we hope. Who's winning? Randy asked, aware that it was a ridiculous question. Who's winning? Nobody's winning. Cities are dying and ships are sinking and aircraft is going in, but nobody's winning. Helen asked the question that she had come to ask. Did you hear Mrs. Van Brooker Brown on the radio a little while ago? Yes. Where do you think she was speaking from? The Admiral walked across the room and looked at the map of the United States. And it was covered with acetate overlay, and 10 or 12 cities were ringed with red crayon, goose eggs, in the way that a unit position is marked on an infantry map. The Admiral scratched the white stubble on his chin and said, I think Denver. Honecker, the 3-star she named Chief of Staff, was Army representative on NORAD in Colorado Springs. Chances are that he was in Denver this morning, or she was in Colorado Springs when the word came through that Washington had been atomized. Helen set down her coffee cup. Her fingers trembled. You're sure? You're sure it couldn't have been Omaha? Omaha, said Admiral. Oh, that's the last place that you'd hear her speaking from. You notice that whenever I've heard a broadcast of any kind that allowed me to identify a city, I ringed it on the map. I've heard no amateurs talking from Omaha, and I haven't heard SAC since the attack. Ordinarily, I can pick up SAC right away. They're always talking on their single sideband transmitter to bases out of the country. Their call sign was Big Fence. I haven't heard Big Fence all day on any frequency, and the enemy hates and fears SAC even more than they fear the Navy. I'll admit it. Scratch Omaha. Sam Hazard realized the effect of his words on Helen's expression. He recalled that Randy's brother, her husband, was an Air Force colonel, and he sensed that he had been tactless. Your husband isn't in Omaha, is he, Miss Bragg? It's our home. I'm terribly sorry that I said anything. A tear was quivering on her cheek, her first, Randy thought, and he felt embarrassed for Sam. Helen said, There's nothing to be sorry about, Admiral. Mark expected Omaha would be hit, and so did I. That's why I am here with the children. But even if Omaha is gone, Mark may still be there, and all right. He had duty this morning. He was in the hole. Ah, yes, the hole, Admiral said. I've never been in it, but I've heard about it. A tremendous shelter, very deep. He may be perfectly safe, and I sincerely hope he is. I'm afraid not, Helen said, since you haven't heard any SAC signals. They may have shifted communications or changed code names. The Admiral looked at his maps. Besides, I'm only guessing. I've just been playing games with myself, trying to G2 a war with no action reports or intelligence. I do this because I haven't anything else to do. I just scramble around and move pins and make marks on the maps and try to keep myself from thinking about Sam Jr. He's a lieutenant, JG, with 6th Fleet in the Med, if 6th Fleet is still in the Med, and I don't think it is. For the Ruskies, it must have been like shooting frogs in a puddle. He turned to Helen again. We inhabit the same purgatory, Mrs. Bragg. It's a dark level of not knowing. Randy asked a question. What are the Russians saying? Can you still get Radio Moscow? I get a station that calls itself Radio Moscow in the 25-meter band, but it isn't Moscow. All the voices on the English language radio broadcasts are different, so we can be pretty certain Moscow isn't there anymore. However, the Russian leaders all seem to be alive and well, and they issue the kind of statements you'd expect. The fact that they're all alive indicates that they took shelter before it started. They probably aren't anywhere close to a target area. Couldn't the president have escaped? He probably had 15 minutes warning. He could have been in a helicopter and away, but in 15 minutes he had to make the big decisions, and so my guess is that he deliberately chose to stay in Washington. Either at his desk in the White House or in the Pentagon command post. It was the same for the Joint Chiefs and probably for the Secretaries of Defense and State. As so the other cabinet members, they probably received it in their sleep or were just getting up. Do you want to hear something strange? The Admiral changed the wavelength on the receiver. He said, now listen. All Randy heard was static. You didn't hear anything, did you? The Admiral said. Right now, on this band, you should be hearing the BBC, Paris, and Bonn. I haven't heard any of them all day. They must have truly clobbered England. BBC is the British Broadcasting Company. Then, do you think we're finished? Randy said. Oh, no, not at all. SAC may have been able to launch up to 50% of its aircraft, counting the planes they already had in the air. And remember that the Navy does have a few missile submarines, and the carriers must have gotten in some leaks too. Alas, I'm pretty sure they weren't able to take out all the SAC bases, including the auxiliaries. For all I know, the enemy may be finished. That doesn't exactly hearten me. The lights went out in the room, the radio died, and at the same time the world outside was illuminated as if midday. At that instant, Randy faced the window, and he would always retain it like a color photograph printed in his brain when he saw a red fox frozen against the Admiral's green lawn. It was the first fox that he had seen in years. The white flashed into a red ball in the southeast, and they all knew what it was. It was Orlando, or the McCoy base, or both. It was the power supply for Timucuan County. Thus, the lights went out, and in that moment, civilization in Fort Repose retreated 100 years. So ended the day.